Buried Alive, the psychological horror of Pelican Bay's Level 4 security housing unit, full documentary. Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning, and the room you are in is 8 feet wide and 10 feet long. There are no windows. The light above you has been on for 3 days straight. You do not know if it is morning or night. You do not know what day it is. You are beginning to forget what a tree looks like. Buried Alive, the psychological horror of Pelican Bay's Level 4 security housing unit, the most psychologically devastating prison environment in the United States of America. A full documentary. This is not a story about punishment. Every prison punishes. This is a story about something that goes much deeper than punishment. This is a story about what happens to the human mind when it is placed in a concrete tomb and left there for months, for years, for decades. And here is the question we are going to answer today. A question that once you hear it, you will not be able to stop thinking about. Can a building, a physical structure of concrete and fluorescent light, destroy a human mind as completely and as permanently as any weapon ever invented? Stay with me, because the answer is documented, it is verified, and it will change the way you think about justice forever. 91%. That is the percentage of inmates in Pelican Bay's Level 4 who developed chronic anxiety so severe it altered their neurological function permanently. 70% reported feeling they were on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. These are not feelings. These are not complaints. These are the documented findings of landmark academic research conducted inside one of America's most secretive correctional facilities. This is what we are going to examine today. Not what these men did to end up inside those walls, but what those walls did to them. Before we go inside the cell, before we examine what happens to a human mind when it is placed in a concrete box and left there, we need to understand something that most people fundamentally misunderstand about solitary confinement. Most people assume that the danger of solitary confinement is boredom. It is not boredom. Boredom is what you feel on a long flight, on a slow afternoon, in a waiting room, with nothing to read. Boredom is uncomfortable. Boredom passes. What happens inside Pelican Bay's Level 4 security housing unit is something that has no comfortable name in everyday language. So researchers gave it one: prison psychosis. And understanding what prison psychosis actually is, what it does to the brain, to the body, to the sense of self, is the only way to truly understand what Pelican Bay's Level 4 was designed, whether intentionally or not, to produce. What Pelican Bay is: the geography of erasure. Pelican Bay State Prison, Crescent City, California, situated in the far northwestern corner of the state, surrounded by ancient redwood forests, Pacific coastal fog, and more than 300 miles of highway separating it from the nearest major city. The location was not accidental. Pelican Bay was designed from its foundation to be the end of the line, the place where the California Department of Corrections sent the people it had decided were too dangerous, too organized, too influential for any ordinary correctional environment. It opened in 1989, and within the first years of its operation, it had already generated more documented allegations of psychological damage, human rights concern, and institutional misconduct than almost any other facility in the history of American corrections. At the center of those allegations always was one specific structure: the security housing unit, the SHU. Level 4. The SHU is not a building in the conventional sense. It is an experience, designed in concrete and steel. Architecturally, it takes the shape of an X-shaped cluster of 132 pods, each pod containing 8 cells, each cell measuring 8 feet wide by 10 feet long, poured concrete. Every surface: the bed, concrete; the desk, concrete; the stool, concrete. No removable parts, no adjustable elements, no personal customization possible. The architects of the SHU made a deliberate choice when they poured every surface from the same unbroken material. The message built into that choice, whether stated explicitly or not, was permanent. Nothing here changes. Nothing here moves. Nothing here responds to you. You are in a world that is completely indifferent to your existence. For most people, hearing that description produces discomfort. For the men placed inside those cells, many of them for years, some of them for decades, that indifference was not a feeling. It was a neurological event. What time does to the mind. Here is the daily structure of life inside the Pelican Bay SHU. Inmates are confined to their cell for between 22 and a half and 24 hours every single day, not as a temporary measure, not as a short-term response to a specific behavioral incident, as a permanent condition of their classification. The remaining time, the fraction of each day, that exists outside the cell, is spent in what the facility calls the exercise yard. And this is where the language of corrections and the reality of the environment diverge most dramatically, because the word yard conjures something specific in the mind: open space, sky, movement, the sensation of distance. The Pelican Bay SHU exercise yard is none of those things. It is a concrete box, 20 feet high, enclosed on all sides by concrete walls. Not open sky, but a metal grate, a mesh of steel, through which a small rectangle of California sky is visible. Inmates who spent years inside the SHU have described standing in that concrete box, looking up at that rectangle of sky through the steel mesh, and feeling, in their own words, like a laboratory animal, like something being observed, like something that existed, not as a person, but as a subject, an organism in a controlled environment, whose responses were being monitored, rather than whose humanity was being acknowledged. That feeling, that specific psychological experience of being reduced from a person to an organism, is not a poetic exaggeration. It has a clinical name: depersonalization, the dissociation of the self from the sense of being a person, the experience of observing oneself from the outside, of feeling that one's thoughts, one's body, one's existence belong to something other than a human being, with agency and dignity and worth. Depersonalization is a documented symptom of severe psychological trauma. It is also one of the first measurable psychological responses to the specific conditions of the Pelican Bay SHU, and it is only the beginning. What light does without darkness. The human brain is not designed for constant light. This is not a philosophical statement. It is a neurological one. The brain's circadian rhythm, its internal clock, the biological system that regulates sleep, wakefulness, hormone production, immune function, emotional regulation, and cognitive performance, is governed by one primary input: the cycle of light and darkness. When light is present, the brain suppresses melatonin and activates cortisol. The body enters an alert, wakeful state. When darkness comes, the process reverses. Melatonin rises. The nervous system begins its essential process of restoration. Remove the darkness, keep the light constant, continuous, unrelenting, and the brain's regulatory system does not simply become confused, it begins to deteriorate. Inside the Pelican Bay SHU, high-intensity fluorescent lights burn 24 hours a day, not dimmed at night, not cycled, not interrupted, constant. The same cold, blue-white fluorescent light that an inmate woke to was the same light that was burning when they closed their eyes to sleep, when they opened their eyes 2 hours later, unable to sleep further, when they lay awake at what might have been 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, because without the cycle of light and dark, there is no way to know. Sleep researchers who have studied the effects of constant light exposure on human subjects document a consistent cascade of consequences. First, sleep fragmentation, the inability to sustain the deep, restorative sleep cycles the brain requires to function. Second, cortisol dysregulation, the stress hormone that is supposed to spike in the morning and fall through the day, begins to operate erratically, spiking at random, flooding the system at moments of stillness and rest, rather than activity. Third, cognitive erosion. Concentration becomes impossible. Memory begins to fragment. The ability to sequence thoughts, to follow a line of reasoning, from beginning to middle to end, starts to break down. Fourth, emotional dysregulation. The brain's capacity to modulate its own emotional responses, to feel fear without becoming panic, to feel anger without becoming rage, requires sleep to maintain. Without adequate sleep, that capacity collapses. And fifth, the consequence that researchers find most difficult to document, because it is most difficult for subjects to articulate: the loss of the boundary between self and environment, the sense that the walls are not outside you, but inside you, that the concrete is not around you, but within you, that you and the cell have become, in some experiential sense, that defies rational description. The same thing. What happens when the voice disappears? Now add to the constant light another dimension of the SHU's sensory architecture: sound, or more precisely, the systematic removal of it. The cells in the Pelican Bay SHU are fitted with perforated steel doors. The perforation serves a function that is architectural and psychological simultaneously. It allows correctional officers to observe the interior of the cell without opening the door. But the perforated steel also acts as a sound baffle. It muffles the sounds of the corridor, of other cells, of other human beings. The result is an acoustic environment that researchers describe as existing in a category between silence and sound, a low, undifferentiated murmur that carries no meaningful information, no voices, no conversation, no laughter, no argument, no music, no footsteps with a recognizable gait, just the baseline hum of an institution processing human beings in complete acoustic indifference. What does sustained silence do to a social species? Because that is what human beings are, a social species. We are not designed for solitude in the way that some animals are. Our brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in conditions of constant social contact. Language, facial expression, tone of voice, the microsignals of human interaction that we process unconsciously hundreds of times per day. The raised eyebrow, the softened voice, the hand that reaches out. These are not luxuries. They are the primary data that the human brain uses to regulate itself, to determine whether the environment is safe, to calibrate emotional responses, to maintain the basic sense of self. That requires, at a neurological level, being seen and recognized by another human being. In order to remain stable, remove that data, place a human being in an environment where no meaningful social signal is available, and the brain does not simply become lonely, it begins to generate the signals itself. This is the documented origin of auditory and visual hallucinations. In long-term solitary confinement, the brain, deprived of external input, begins to produce its own voices, shapes in the peripheral vision, the sense of a presence in the cell. That rational assessment confirms is not there, but that the nervous system insists on experiencing, because the alternative, complete absence, is more than the human brain was designed to process. Several inmates in the Pelican Bay SHU reported something that researchers found particularly significant. They reported losing the ability to speak, not losing the physical capacity, not a medical condition affecting the vocal cords, but losing the habit of speech. After months without conversation, without a single exchange of more than a few functional words with a correctional officer, passing food through a slot, the linguistic pathways of the brain begin to atrophy. The internal voice, the constant stream of language with which most people narrate their own experience, grows quieter, slower, more fragmented, until some inmates reported sitting in complete internal silence. No inner monologue, no internal narrative, no language at all, staring at a concrete wall for hours without a single coherent thought moving through their mind. This is not meditation. This is not peace. This is the brain shutting down non-essential systems to preserve its core functions, the neurological equivalent of a ship jettisoning cargo in a storm to stay afloat. When the brain begins to eat itself, there is a phrase that researchers who study long-term sensory deprivation have used to describe the advanced stage of psychological deterioration inside environments like the Pelican Bay SHU, biological burial. It means exactly what it sounds like. A person who is physically alive, whose heart is beating, whose lungs are breathing, whose body is being fed the minimum required for survival, but whose mind has entered a state so depleted, so devoid of the stimulation it requires to function, that it has begun to turn its processing capacity inward, to consume itself. Neuroscientists call the underlying process autophagia of the mind. In the absence of external stimuli to process and respond to, the brain does not simply idle. It cannot idle. The human brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy, more than any other organ. Even at rest, it is, in metabolic terms, an extraordinarily expensive organ, and it is an organ that was never designed for true inactivity. When external stimulation falls below a critical threshold, when the brain has processed every detail of the 8x10 concrete cell so many times that there is literally nothing new to process, it begins to turn its extraordinary processing power on itself, on memories, but not the organized narrative memories of a healthy mind, reflecting on its past, fragmented memories, intrusive memories, memories that arrive without context or sequence, a face, a smell, a sound, disconnected from any coherent story, on fears, but not the functional fears of a mind assessing real threats, catastrophic fears, irrational fears, fears that expand to fill the available space, which in a 10x8 cell is limitless in its psychological dimensions, even as it is absolute in its physical ones. On the body itself, Long-term SHU inmates have documented an experience that psychiatrists classify as somatic hyperawareness, an obsessive, involuntary attention to the sensations of one's own body. In the absence of anything else to attend to, the heartbeat becomes deafening. The sensation of breathing becomes a conscious, effortful act, rather than an automatic one. Some inmates have reported becoming convinced that their heart was stopping, that their breathing was failing, that their body was dying around them. Not because there was any medical evidence of this, but because the mind, with nothing else to process, had turned its full analytical capacity on the body's normal functions, and found in that unprecedented scrutiny things to be terrified of. The brain had begun to consume itself. The biological burial had begun. What research actually found? In the 1990s, the team of researchers gained access to the Pelican Bay SHU to conduct what would become one of the most cited studies in the academic literature on the psychological effects of solitary confinement. What they found was not what correctional administrators had predicted. The assumption, the institutional assumption, that had justified the SHU's design was that isolating the most dangerous, most organizationally sophisticated inmates would produce compliance, would produce manageability, would produce a population that had been sufficiently deterred from the behaviors that had placed them in the SHU. In the first place, the research found something categorically different. 91% of SHU inmates suffered from chronic anxiety and nervousness, so persistent and so severe that it interfered with basic cognitive function. Not occasional anxiety, not situational stress, chronic, constant, unrelenting. 88% experienced irrational anger, and what researchers documented as profound social withdrawal, the paradox of a population already in forced isolation, withdrawing further from the limited social contact available to them, retreating from the few words exchanged through a perforated steel door, refusing visits, refusing phone calls, not out of defiance, but because the capacity for social engagement had been so thoroughly eroded that even minimal contact had become overwhelming, overstimulating, frightening. The social species had been made asocial, and perhaps most significantly, 70% of the SHU population studied reported feeling they were on the verge of a total nervous breakdown, not metaphorically, not as an expression of frustration, but as a genuine, terrifying, daily experience of feeling the structural integrity of their own mind fracturing, cracking, like concrete under sustained pressure, like the walls of the cell itself, slowly and visibly, in ways that no one on the outside could see, beginning to give way. What 10 years without a tree does. There is a finding from the research on Pelican Bay's SHU that receives less attention than the psychiatric data, but that may, in some ways, tell the story most clearly. Many inmates in the Pelican Bay SHU went more than 10 years without seeing a tree, without seeing a blade of grass, without seeing a bird in flight, without seeing any living thing that was not a human being in a correctional uniform. 10 years. For context, a child born the year someone entered the SHU would be completing primary school by the time that person saw a tree again. This is not a peripheral detail. There is an established body of research in environmental psychology documenting what scientists call attention restoration theory. The theory, supported by decades of experimental research, holds that exposure to natural environments, to trees, to water, to open sky, to the movement of animals, and the unpredictability of weather, provides the human brain with a specific kind of cognitive restoration that no built environment can replicate. Natural environments engage what researchers call involuntary attention, a mode of engagement that is effortless, restorative, and essential for the recovery of the directed attention that cognitive work requires. Remove natural environments entirely, place a human being in a space where every surface is manufactured, every line is straight, every texture is uniform, and the brain's restorative capacity is not simply reduced, it is eliminated. The directed attention that the brain needs to think clearly, to regulate emotions, to maintain the coherent narrative of self. That is the foundation of psychological health, has nowhere to restore itself. It depletes, and when directed attention depletes, without the possibility of restoration, the cognitive and emotional consequences are not temporary. Research on former SHU inmates documents that the neurological effects of long-term nature deprivation, combined with the other sensory conditions of the SHU environment, produced changes in brain function that persisted long after release, long after the man had left the cell. long after he stood in open air, for the first time in years, long after the first tree, the first blade of grass, the first bird, appeared in his field of vision. The brain had reorganized itself around the absence, and reorganized brains do not simply unreorganize when the conditions change, the impossible choice. But here is the dimension of the Pelican Bay SHU experience that transforms it from a story about architecture and neuroscience into something closer to a study in impossible choices, a moral trap so precisely constructed that no rational response to it is available. Historically, there was one official pathway out of the Pelican Bay SHU, one way to earn a return to general population, to sunlight, to human contact, to the restoration of something approaching a livable existence. The debrief, to debrief, meant to sit down with correctional investigators and provide information, names, organizational structures, the identities of gang affiliates, the operational details of criminal enterprises, both inside and outside prison walls. In other words, to become an informant for a man whose entire social identity, whose entire sense of belonging, of loyalty, of what it meant to be a person of integrity, was organized around an absolute prohibition on exactly this act. The debrief was not simply an administrative procedure, it was the destruction of the self, and the consequences of debriefing extended far beyond the psychological. In the culture of the California prison system, in the code that governed relationships, reputations, and the physical safety of every person inside, an informant was not simply someone who had broken a rule. An informant was a target, a man who debriefed and was returned to general population, was a man who had placed himself in immediate, documented, statistically verified physical danger. The prison yard had its own justice system, its own enforcement mechanism, its own certainty of consequences for violation of its core code, and that certainty was as absolute as anything the official system had ever produced. So the choice presented to every man in the Pelican Bay SHU who was considering the debrief was not a choice between a difficult option and a comfortable one. It was a choice between two forms of destruction. Stay in the SHU, lose your mind, slowly, certainly, over months and years of fluorescent light and concrete silence, and the brain consuming itself in the absence of anything else to consume. Debrief and return to the yard. Risk your life immediately with a level of certainty that made the risk not a calculation, but a near guarantee. Between losing your mind and losing your life, between the biological burial of the SHU and the physical danger of the yard, choose. This is the trap that the Pelican Bay SHU placed at the center of its operational logic, and the extraordinary psychological weight of being forced to live inside that trap, day after day, week after week, year after year, is something that the psychiatric data struggles to fully capture, because there are no clinical categories precise enough to describe the specific suffering of a person who is not simply confined, but cornered, trapped between two forms of annihilation, with no exit, that does not destroy something essential, the architecture of erasure. Step back now from the individual cell, from the individual mind, and look at the structure itself. The X shape of the SHU pod cluster is not accidental. It is the physical expression of a design philosophy that prison architects and correctional administrators had spent decades developing. The X configuration allows a single correctional officer stationed at the center of the X to observe all four arms simultaneously. Maximum surveillance, minimum staffing, but it achieves something else that is more psychologically significant. The X configuration means that an inmate in any cell, in any arm of the X, is never more than 10 feet from another human being. 10 feet, the distance across a modest living room, the length of a short hallway, and yet that 10 feet, that concrete wall, between one cell and the next, is an absolute barrier. No sound passes through it in any meaningful way. No visual contact is possible. No communication of any kind that the perforated steel doors and the concrete walls do not permit. The X shape of the SHU is perhaps the most precise physical expression of the facility's psychological purpose. You are never alone in the conventional sense. There are other human beings within arm's reach, and yet you are more profoundly isolated than almost any human being in the history of organized incarceration has ever been. The proximity makes the isolation more acute, not less, because the brain knows that other people are there. It can hear at the very edge of perception the sounds of human existence through the perforated steel, a cough, a movement, an indeterminate sound that might be speech or might be nothing, and that almost signal, that information, that arrives just below the threshold of meaningful communication is, in some documented accounts, more psychologically destabilizing than complete silence would be, because the brain reaches for it, strains toward it, tries to resolve it into something meaningful, a word, a message, the sound of another person, acknowledging your existence, and fails every time. That repeated reaching and repeated failure is its own form of psychological erosion. The architecture had found a way to use human beings' need for connection as an instrument of their own psychological deterioration. By the time a man had spent 1 year inside the Pelican Bay, 1 year of the 23-hour loop, of the fluorescent light, of the concrete silence, of the impossible choice between the debrief and the breakdown, of the X-shaped architecture, of engineered isolation, he was not the same person who had entered, not because prison changes people, every prison changes people, but because the Pelican Bay changed something more fundamental than behavior, more fundamental than attitude, more fundamental than any of the things that correctional philosophy typically claims to address. It changed the structure of the mind itself, the neurological architecture, the cognitive pathways, the emotional regulatory systems, the capacity for language, for social engagement, for the basic sense of continuous selfhood that most of us move through our lives, taking completely for granted. And the men who spent not 1 year, but 5 years, 10 years, 20 years in that environment emerged, if they emerged, carrying damage that no release date could fully address, because the cells they had lived in had, in the most precise and documented sense, followed them out. We examine the system that built the SHU, the legal battles that tried to dismantle it, the Gladiator era that exposed its darkest chapter, and the question that no court has ever fully answered: at what point does a correctional facility stop being a prison and become something else entirely? But before we go there, I need to ask you something. 91% of inmates in Pelican Bay's SHU developed chronic anxiety so severe it permanently altered their brain function. 70% felt they were on the verge of a total nervous breakdown every single day. If we documented these same effects in any other context, in a school, in a workplace, in a hospital, we would call it a human rights crisis and shut it down immediately. So why does the conversation change when it happens inside a prison? I genuinely want to know what you think. Leave your answer below. Life inside the global prison and legal machine. Every institution tells a story about itself, a story about its purpose, about why it exists, about what it is designed to achieve. Pelican Bay State Prison told a very clear story about itself. It was designed, its administrators said, to contain the unconquerable, to isolate the most dangerous, to remove from the general population the individuals whose influence, whose organizational reach, whose capacity for violence, whose power over other inmates made every other facility less safe by their presence. That was the official story. But institutions, like people, have a second story, the one that lives, not in the press releases and the policy documents and the administrative handbooks, but in the incident reports, in the court filings, in the testimonies of the men who lived inside the walls and the officers who worked within them. That second story is what Act 2 is about. The Gladiator era, when the institution became the threat. Between 1989 and 1993, the first 4 years of Pelican Bay's operation, something was happening inside its walls that would eventually require federal courts, civil rights attorneys, and a landmark judicial ruling to fully expose. It began with numbers. Between 1989 and 1993, correctional officers at Pelican Bay discharged their weapons 177 times. 177 in 4 years, in a single facility. 3 of those discharges resulted in the deaths of inmates. For context, most maximum security correctional facilities in the United States record weapons discharges in the single digits across comparable time periods. 177 is not a statistic that exists within the range of normal institutional variation. It is a number that demands explanation, and the explanation that emerged through court testimony, through investigative journalism, through the accounts of inmates, former officers, and independent monitors, was one that California's correctional system was deeply reluctant to provide. The explanation had a name that the people inside gave it before any official investigation had begun. The Gladiator fights. Reports from the early 1990s alleged that correctional officers at Pelican Bay were releasing rival gang members into the same small exercise enclosure, the same concrete dog run. We examined in Act 1, and observing the outcome, not intervening, not separating, observing, placing two men, whose organizational affiliations made violent conflict between them, not just likely, but essentially certain, and watching what happened next, and when what happened next became serious enough to require intervention, intervening with lethal force, with the weapons that produced 177 discharges in 4 years. Vaughn Dortch, the hot bath incident. But of all the documented incidents, from Pelican Bay's early years, of all the cases that would eventually be examined by federal courts and human rights researchers, one stands apart, not because it involved the most people, not because it produced the most dramatic legal outcome, but because of what it revealed about the specific vulnerability of the most psychologically fragile inmates inside the SHU. 1992, Pelican Bay State Prison. Vaughn Dortch was a mentally ill inmate housed in the SHU. His mental illness, documented in his institutional records, known to the staff responsible for his care, had been significantly worsened by the conditions of the SHU itself, the 23-hour confinement, the constant fluorescent light, the sensory deprivation, the biological burial. We examined in Act 1 for a mind that was already struggling, that was already navigating a pre-existing psychiatric condition. Without adequate clinical support, the SHU's conditions were not simply difficult, they were catastrophic. In 1992, Vaughn Dortch, according to court-documented testimony and the findings of a federal judicial review, was placed by correctional officers into a bath of scalding water. While handcuffed, the water was hot enough to cause second and third degree burns across a significant portion of his body. A nurse who treated Dortch testified in subsequent legal proceedings that his skin peeled off like a glove when his legs were lifted from the water. The incident produced one of the most unambiguous findings in the landmark federal case that would reshape the legal understanding of Pelican Bay's SHU. The case was Madrid versus Gomez, 1995, United States District Court, Northern District of California. Federal Judge Thelton Henderson presided over a proceeding that examined, in extraordinary detail, the conditions inside Pelican Bay's SHU and the conduct of its officers across its first years of operation. His findings were historic. Madrid v. Gomez. The court looks inside. Judge Henderson's ruling in Madrid versus Gomez did something that no previous federal court had done with the same specificity. In relation to a California correctional facility, it looked inside, not at the policies, not at the administrative documentation, not at the official story the institution told about itself, but at the actual documented, witnessed reality of what was happening inside the SHU. And what Judge Henderson found produced a ruling that used language rarely applied to American correctional facilities. He found that the conditions in the Pelican Bay SHU constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution for a specific population, for the mentally ill. The ruling held that placing inmates with serious mental illness in the conditions of the Pelican Bay SHU was unconstitutional, that the environment, the fluorescent light, the sensory deprivation, the 23-hour confinement, the social isolation was not simply harsh. For a person with pre-existing psychiatric conditions, it was destructive, measurably, documentably, constitutionally intolerably. But here is what the ruling also found, and this is the part that received less attention in the coverage that followed. For inmates who did not have pre-existing serious mental illness, for inmates whose minds were, at entry, functioning within the range of psychological health, the court found that the conditions did not reach the constitutional threshold of cruel and unusual punishment, not because the conditions were not psychologically damaging. The research was clear that they were, but because the legal standard required something more than documented psychological harm. It required a finding that the harm was so severe, so beyond the bounds of what a civilized society could tolerate, that no legitimate penological purpose could justify it, and the court, in 1995, was not yet prepared to make that finding. For the general SHU population, it would take another 2 decades, another legal challenge, and an event of extraordinary collective will from inside the SHU itself to bring that question back before the courts with sufficient force to produce a different answer. The hunger strikes when silence became a weapon. 2011, Pelican Bay State Prison. SHU Level 4, a group of inmates, men who had spent years, and in some cases decades, inside the SHU, organized something that, given the environment they were in, required a degree of coordination and collective discipline that the correctional system had spent years insisting the SHU made impossible. A hunger strike, not a small localized protest, a hunger strike that at its peak involved over 30,000 inmates across the California prison system, SHU residents and general population alike, refusing food in solidarity with the demands of the Pelican Bay SHU prisoners. 30,000 people. The demands were specific, documented, reasonable, end indefinite SHU confinement, provide adequate food and programming, end the Debrief or state policy that had trapped inmates between psychological destruction and physical danger for more than 2 decades. The hunger strike accomplished something that 2 decades of legal proceedings had not fully achieved and made the SHU impossible to ignore. The scale of the collective action, the evidence that men, in the most isolated, most sensory deprived, most psychologically deteriorating environment in the California system, had nonetheless maintained sufficient organizational coherence to coordinate a system-wide protest, directly contradicted the foundational justification for the SHU's existence. The SHU was supposed to break organizational capacity. The hunger strike demonstrated that it had not, that the human capacity for solidarity, for collective action, for the reaching toward other people, that is as fundamental to the species as breathing, had survived. Even the 23-hour loop, even the fluorescent torture, even the biological burial of the SHU's design. In 2015, following years of legal challenge and negotiation, that the hunger strikes had accelerated, California announced the effective end of indefinite SHU confinement, based solely on gang affiliation, the policy that had placed men in the SHU, not for specific behavioral violations, but for who they were, affiliated with. The policy at the center of the Debrief trap was reformed. It was not a complete victory. The SHU continued to exist. The conditions inside it changed slowly and completely, but it was a beginning, a crack in the concrete that had seemed for so long absolutely impenetrable. The institutions mirror what Pelican Bay revealed about the system. Step back now from the specific incidents, from the Gladiator fights, and the hot bath, and the hunger strikes, and the federal rulings, and look at what the full story of Pelican Bay's SHU reveals about the system that built it. The SHU was not an accident. It was not the result of a few bad actors in positions of authority. It was the designed, funded, politically supported, legally defended product of a correctional philosophy that had decided, with the full weight of institutional authority behind it, that certain human beings were beyond rehabilitation, beyond programming, beyond the possibility of any future that did not take place inside a concrete tomb. That decision, and the institution it produced, tells us something that extends far beyond the specific history of Pelican Bay. Tells us that institutions are capable of causing the precise harm they claim to prevent, that a facility designed to manage the most dangerous can, through its own practices, produce danger of a different and arguably more fundamental kind. Not the danger of physical violence, though that was documented in 177 weapons discharges, but the danger of a system that has decided some lives are not worth the effort of humanity, that some people can simply be erased, placed in a concrete box, left in fluorescent light, given an impossible choice, and forgotten until the court's notice, until 30,000 people refuse to eat, until the second story, the one that lives in the incident reports, in the court filings, in the testimonies of the men who were inside, becomes impossible for the official story to contain. The Gladiator era ended. The hot bath case was adjudicated. The hunger strikes produced reform. The indefinite SHU policy was changed. But the men who spent years inside, before any of that happened, the men whose minds were buried alive in concrete and fluorescent light for decades before the courts and the protests and the reforms arrived, those men did not get their years back, did not get their neurological health back, did not get back the trees they didn't see, the voices they lost, the cognitive pathways that deteriorated in the 23-hour loop of a cell that the institution told them was not punishment, just policy. In Act 3, we examine the scar, what the SHU left behind, in the minds of the men who survived it, and in the families the communities, and the correctional staff who lived in its shadow. But first, I need to ask you something. In 1995, a federal court found that placing mentally ill inmates in the Pelican Bay SHU was unconstitutional, but found that the same conditions were acceptable for everyone else. That distinction between what we owe to the visibly vulnerable and what we owe to everyone sits at the center of how we think about justice. Do you think the psychological damage documented in the SHU was severe enough to be unconstitutional for all inmates, not just the mentally ill? Leave your perspective below. This is one of the most important legal and moral questions in the American justice system right now. The lasting mental impact on everyone involved. There is a moment that many former SHU inmates describe in almost identical terms. The moment they walked out, not out of the SHU specifically, out of prison entirely, into open air, into a world with distance in it, with color, with the sound of wind, and traffic, and human voices, not filtered through perforated steel. And almost every account describes the same unexpected response to that moment. Not relief, not the rush of freedom that the movies have trained us to expect, but something closer to terror. Because the nervous system that had spent years reorganizing itself around 8 feet by 10 feet, around concrete and fluorescent light, and the 23-hour loop was now being asked to process a world it no longer had the neurological architecture to handle. Too much space, too much sound, too much unpredictability, too much input, and the brain, which had spent years learning to function in the absence of stimulation, now encountered stimulation at a scale it could no longer process and shut down. The neuroscience of aftermath, what the brain cannot unlearn. Neuroscientists who study the long-term effects of prolonged solitary confinement describe a phenomenon that has no comfortable name. In popular language, structural neurological reorganization. It means exactly what it sounds like. The brain, responding to the conditions of the SHU over months and years, did not simply become stressed, did not simply become anxious, did not simply become damaged in the way that a bone is damaged by a fracture, with a clear injury and a clear pathway to healing. It reorganized, it rewired its own architecture to function optimally in an environment of extreme sensory deprivation, social isolation, and chronic unpredictable threat. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, for impulse control, for social cognition, for the regulation of fear responses, showed measurable reduction in functional activity. In long-term SHU inmates, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, showed the opposite pattern. Hyperactivation, permanently primed, permanently scanning, permanently prepared for a threat level that the outside world rarely actually presented. This combination, reduced prefrontal function, hyperactive amygdala, is precisely the neurological profile that makes reintegration into society so extraordinarily difficult for long-term SHU survivors, because the brain that is optimized for the SHU is a brain that struggles to do the things that ordinary life requires, to sit in a room with other people without reading threat in every movement, to make plans that extend beyond the next few hours, to regulate anger when something goes wrong, to trust. And the cruelest element of structural neurological reorganization is its persistence. These are not temporary symptoms. Research on former SHU inmates, conducted years after release, documents the continuation of neurological patterns established inside the cell. The brain learned the SHU, and it did not easily unlearn it. The families loving someone the SHU returned, but the neurological aftermath of the SHU was not carried only by the men who left it. It was carried home into the households that had waited for years or decades for a father, a son, a partner to come back. And what came back was not always recognizable as the person who left. Family members of long-term SHU survivors describe a specific, consistent pattern in the accounts collected by researchers and clinicians who worked with reentry populations. Emotional unavailability, not coldness exactly, not hostility, but an absence, a quality of interior distance that no amount of love, or patience, or time seemed to fully close, because the SHU had systematically dismantled the neurological infrastructure of emotional connection, the capacity to read another person's emotional state, to interpret facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, requires practice. It requires the constant, daily exercise of being around other people and processing their signals. Take that practice away for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, and the capacity does not simply pause. It atrophies, like a muscle that has not been used. The returned man sat at the dinner table with his family and struggled to read the emotional temperature of the room, struggled to understand why his child was upset, struggled to calibrate the appropriate response to ordinary domestic conflict, a disagreement over homework, a misunderstanding between siblings, because his nervous system had been trained to interpret every unresolved tension as a potential physical threat. And the family, the wife, the children, the parents who had waited, experienced this not as the neurological consequence there was, but as rejection, as evidence that the person they had waited for had not come back, that something essential had been left behind in the concrete cell. The children, the second generation of damage, the children of long-term SHU survivors, occupy a position in this story that is rarely examined and almost never discussed in the policy conversations around solitary confinement reform. They were not in the SHU. They experienced none of its direct conditions, and yet the research on their outcomes, on their educational achievement, their mental health, their own eventual contact with the justice system tells a story that developmental psychologists find deeply significant. Attachment disruption. Children whose primary caregiver was absent for the formative years of their development, particularly absent in the specific way of incarceration, with its combination of physical absence and the social stigma that shapes how a child understands and explains that absence to themselves and to the world, develop in ways that carry measurable risk. When that parent returns, when the absence ends, and the physical presence resumes, the relationship does not simply pick up where it left off. The child, who learned to function without that parent, has reorganized their own attachment system around the absence, has learned at a level deeper than conscious thought that people leave. That presence is temporary. That attachment produces risk. And the parent, who returns neurologically reorganized by this, who struggles with emotional availability, with impulse regulation, with the ordinary demands of closeness and vulnerability, confirms inadvertently every adaptive belief the child developed. In their absence, people leave. Presence is temporary. Attachment produces risk. This is the intergenerational transmission of the SHU's damage, not through genetics, not through any deliberate act, but through the invisible, neurologically mediated, psychologically precise process by which the conditions of one generation's imprisonment shape the developmental architecture of the next generation's childhood. The correctional officers, the cost of administering the tomb, and then there are the people who went to work inside the SHU every day, who walked its corridors, who passed food through slots, who watched whether they chose to or not, what prolonged isolation did to human beings. The correctional officers of the Pelican Bay SHU are almost never part of the conversation about its psychological legacy. The focus goes, appropriately, to the inmates, to the documented damage, to the constitutional violations, but the officers who administered that environment for years and decades carry their own form of the SHU's aftermath, moral injury, the specific psychological damage, produced not by fear, not by direct trauma, but by the sustained experience of participating in, or witnessing, or failing to prevent, actions that conflict with one's own moral values. Research on correctional officer mental health in supermax environments documents rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress that are significantly higher than in officers working in general population facilities, not because supermax facilities are more physically dangerous for officers. In many measurable ways, they are less so, but because the psychological cost of working in an environment where human deterioration is not an unfortunate side effect, but an operational feature, where the progressive psychological destruction of the people in your care is something you observe, shift after shift, year after year, accumulates in ways that performance reviews and retirement packages do not address. Several former SHU officers who spoke to researchers and journalists in the years following Pelican Bay's reform era described a common experience: the dreams, not nightmares exactly, not dramatic, violent, cinematic trauma responses, but the low-frequency, persistent, inescapable dreams of the corridor, of the walk from one end of the SHU to the other, of the perforated steel doors, passing on either side of the fluorescent light that looked the same at the beginning of the shift and the end, of the faces they never saw because the doors were always closed, but whose voices they knew, whose deterioration they tracked. In the quality of those voices, over months and years, the corridor followed them home, the same way the cell followed the inmates, different architecture, same damage. The communities, what returns to the neighborhood when a man who spent 10 or 15 or 20 years in the Pelican Bay SHU is eventually released. He does not return to a correctional facility. He returns to a neighborhood, to a community, to streets and buildings and people that have continued to exist and to change in his absence. And he arrives carrying the full neurological legacy of what the SHU produced in him: the hyperactive amygdala, the reduced prefrontal function, the atrophied social cognition, the terror of open space, the inability to trust into a community that has no institutional infrastructure designed to receive him, no clinical support calibrated to the specific neurological profile of long-term solitary confinement, no employer equipped to understand why the man who seems so controlled, so quiet, so self-contained in the interview suddenly cannot function in an open-plan office, no housing provider prepared for the man who prefers to sit with his back to the wall, who cannot sleep in a room without knowing exactly where the exits are, who sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, wakes in a cold sweat because the ceiling is too far away. The community receives him as best it can, with the love that survived his absence, with the practical support that family and neighbors and community organizations can provide, and with the very limited tools available in communities that are themselves often under-resourced, under-supported, and carrying their own accumulated histories of exactly the kind of institutional failure that produced Pelican Bay in the first place. The SHU's damage does not end at the gate. It disperses into families, into households, into the developmental experiences of children, into the strained capacity of communities to absorb and support the men and women the system returns to them and states the system never prepared them for. The biological burial does not stay inside the concrete tomb. It travels in the nervous systems of the men who were inside, in the attachment patterns of their children, in the moral injuries of the officers who administered it, in the quiet, unspectacular, daily struggle of communities trying to integrate what the institution produced. The scar of the Pelican Bay is not a scar that sits in one place. It is distributed across individuals, across families, across communities, across the professional lives of the people who went to work inside the tomb and carried the corridor home with them. And it is a scar that the official record, the policy documents, the administrative reports, the court findings only partially captures, because the deepest damage does not appear in incident reports. It appears in the dreams of former officers, in the emotional distance of returned fathers, in the adaptive beliefs of children who learn too early that presence is temporary and attachment produces risk. In the body of a man standing in open air for the first time in a decade, surrounded by space, by light, by the living world, and feeling in the place where relief should be only the specific, documentable, neurologically precise terror of a brain that has forgotten how to be free. Our final act, we step back from the details and ask the question this entire story has been building toward. Not what did the SHU do? We know what it did, but what does it mean that we built it? What does it tell us about justice, about punishment, about the kind of society we are, and the kind we are capable of becoming? But first, I need to ask you something. The research is clear. The neurological damage produced by long-term SHU confinement persists long after release, shaping not just the survivor but their children, their families, and their communities for years afterward. If we know a punishment produces this level of damage that spreads across generations, does that change your view of whether it should be used at all? Or are there crimes and individuals for whom no alternative is acceptable? This is one of the most difficult questions in criminal justice. I want your honest answer below. What it means that we built this. We have traveled far together in this documentary, from the architectural blueprint of an 8x10 concrete cell, through the neuroscience of a brain consuming itself in fluorescent light, through the Gladiator era, the hot bath, the court that looked inside and found what it found, through the families and the children and the officers who carried the corridor home. And now, before we close, I want to do something that this story demands, but that most documentaries are reluctant to do. I want to hold the institution up to the light, Not the institution of Pelican Bay specifically, not the California Department of Corrections, but the institution of the idea itself. The idea that isolation, complete, prolonged, engineered isolation, is a legitimate instrument of justice. Because that idea did not begin in California. It did not begin in 1989. It has a history, a philosophy, a set of arguments made by serious people in serious institutions across centuries, and examining those arguments honestly, rigorously, with the full weight of what we now know is the only way to understand not just what Pelican Bay was, but what it meant. The history of the idea, where solitary began. The idea of solitary confinement as a tool of rehabilitation is not a modern invention. It traces directly to the early 19th century, to the Quaker reformers of Philadelphia, who looked at the brutal, chaotic, overcrowded prisons of their era and saw something that needed to be fixed. Their solution was the Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, opened 1829. The philosophy was genuinely humane, and its intentions: remove the prisoner from the corrupting influence of other criminals, give them silence, give them solitude, give them time to reflect on their actions, to feel genuine remorse, to reconnect through the silence with their own conscience and with God. Penitentiary, the word itself, comes from penitent, from the idea of genuine, interior, transformative regret. The Quaker reformers were not cruel people. They were, by the standards of their era, extraordinarily compassionate. They were horrified by the violence and degradation of conventional prisons. They genuinely believed that solitude and reflection could heal what crime and poverty and moral failure had broken. They were wrong. Within decades of Eastern states opening, the evidence was accumulating that prolonged solitary confinement did not produce penitent, rehabilitated individuals ready to rejoin society, produced exactly what the research from Pelican Bay would document a century and a half later: psychological deterioration, cognitive fragmentation, the systematic destruction of the social and emotional capacities that reintegration requires. Charles Dickens visited Eastern State in 1842. What he wrote afterward used language that would not be out of place in a modern psychiatric assessment. He described the solitary inmates as existing in a condition of living death, of being buried alive, the same phrase that researchers use today to describe the psychological state of long-term SHU confinement, separated by nearly 200 years of history. The language is identical because the experience is identical, because the human brain has not changed, and what extended isolation does to it has not changed. What has changed is our ability to measure the damage and our willingness to act on what the measurements show. The global mirror, IT, is not only America. The United States is not alone in its use of prolonged solitary confinement. Versions of the practice exist in correctional systems across the democratic world. In the United Kingdom, closed supervision centers, the British equivalent of the Supermax SHU, have generated significant human rights scrutiny from organizations including the Prison Reform Trust and Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons. In Canada, administrative segregation, the formal name for solitary confinement, was ruled unconstitutional by the British Columbia Court of Appeal in 2019, with the court finding that prolonged isolation violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Unconstitutional. In the Netherlands, a country consistently ranked among the most progressive in the world on criminal justice matters, research on their use of solitary confinement documented the same neurological consequences found in Pelican Bay. Different language, different legal system, different correctional philosophy, same damage, because the damage is not produced by any specific country's correctional culture. It is produced by the conditions themselves, by the removal of social contact, by the destruction of the circadian rhythm, by the sensory deprivation that sends the brain searching inward for stimulation it cannot find outside, by the biological facts of what a social species requires to remain a functioning member of its own kind. These facts do not vary by nationality, do not vary by the political system of the country conducting the confinement, do not vary by the severity of the crime that preceded the placement in isolation. The brain does not know which country it is in. It only knows what it is receiving and what it receives in prolonged solitary confinement. In every country, in every facility, in every era, from Eastern State in 1829 to Pelican Bay in 1989 to the units still operating today is the same. Not enough. Not enough input. Not enough contact. Not enough of the fundamental stimulation that the human brain requires to remain the human brain. The argument for taking the other side seriously. At this point in the documentary, I want to do something that I think intellectual honesty requires. I want to take seriously the argument for solitary confinement because it exists. It is made by serious people, and dismissing it without engaging with it would be intellectually dishonest. The argument goes like this. There are individuals whose presence in any general population makes that population measurably more dangerous. Individuals whose organizational influence, whose capacity for violence, whose ability to orchestrate harm from inside a prison extends not just to other inmates, but to communities outside the walls. For those individuals, the argument holds, the alternative to isolation is not some comfortable middle ground. The alternative is more violence, more victims, more harm to real people in real communities, and the obligation of the correctional system to protect those people, to protect the officers working the yard, the inmates in general population, the communities connected to the criminal enterprises that organized crime figures can run from inside a cell. That obligation is real. This argument deserves an honest response, and the honest response is, it contains genuine truth. There are individuals for whom some form of separation from general population is genuinely necessary. The question that the evidence demands we ask is not whether to separate, it is how. Because the documented damage of the Pelican Bay SHU model, the 23-hour loop, the constant fluorescent light, the sensory deprivation, the indefinite duration, the debrief trap, is not the inevitable consequence of separating a dangerous individual from general population. It is the consequence of a specific design, a design that chose to maximize isolation rather than minimize danger, a design that chose to remove not just the organizational threat, but every element of human experience that the brain requires to remain functional. Researchers and correctional reformers have documented that it is possible to design separation units that reduce the genuine threat posed by the most dangerous individuals without producing the documented neurological destruction of the SHU model, that provide meaningful human contact, that maintain the circadian rhythm, that offer programming, education, the basic stimulation that keeps the prefrontal cortex functional and the amygdala from permanent hyperactivation, that's separate without burying. That is the design question that the documented damage of the SHU forces us to take seriously. The question of what justice actually requires. But underneath the design question is a deeper one, a philosophical one, that the full history of solitary confinement, from the Quaker reformers of 1829 to the federal courts of 1995 to the hunger strikes of 2011, has never fully resolved. What is justice for? If the purpose of criminal justice is punishment, the infliction of suffering, proportional to the harm caused, then the argument for the SHU has a certain cold logic. The men placed in Pelican Bay's Level 4 had, in many cases, caused serious harm to victims, to communities, to other incarcerated people, and the SHU caused them serious harm in return. An eye for an eye, the oldest logic of justice in human civilization. But if the purpose of criminal justice is something more than punishment, if it includes rehabilitation, reintegration, the reduction of future harm, the protection of communities that will eventually receive the men and women the system returns to them, then the SHU model fails by its own terms, because the documented neurological damage of prolonged solitary confinement does not produce people who are less dangerous when they re-enter society. It produces people who are more dangerous, whose threat response systems are permanently heightened, whose capacity for social regulation has been systematically degraded, whose ability to navigate the ordinary demands of civilian life has been measurably reduced by the very intervention that was supposed to make them safer to be around. The SHU did not rehabilitate. The evidence is clear on this. It did not reduce future harm. The evidence is clear on this too. What it did, reliably, documentably, across decades of operation, was produce the specific neurological profile that makes reintegration more difficult and recidivism more likely by its own stated purposes, by the standards of its own institutional justifications. The Pelican Bay SHU was a documented failure. The civilization test, what we reveal about ourselves. There is a principle attributed to various thinkers across various centuries from Dostoevsky to Winston Churchill to Nelson Mandela, that recurs in discussions of criminal justice with enough regularity that it has become almost a cliché. The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. It is a cliché because it is true, because the way a society treats the people it has decided to punish, the people it has placed outside the normal protections of community and law, reveals something about that society's values that its more public-facing institutions can obscure. Anyone can be generous to the people they like. Anyone can be humane to the people they consider worthy. The test of a society's values is what it does to the people it has decided are not worthy, to the people it has decided are too dangerous, too organized, too far beyond redemption to be treated as full members of the human community. The Pelican Bay SHU was what California decided to do with those people. Concrete and fluorescent light, 23 hours and 8 by 10 feet, an impossible choice between psychological destruction and physical danger, and the federal court that reviewed those conditions in 1995 and found them constitutional for everyone except the mentally ill was what the legal system decided those conditions were worth. Both of those decisions, the institutional decision and the legal one, tell us something about the values of the society that made them, not the values in the founding documents, not the values in the speeches and the mission statements and the policy frameworks, the values revealed under pressure, the values that emerge when the people being treated are people that most of the voting, tax-paying, policy-influencing public never has to think about. Those values are the real ones, and looking at them honestly, sitting with what they reveal, is the most important thing this documentary can ask of you. What has changed and what has not? Since the landmark hunger strikes of 2011 and the policy reforms that followed, the Pelican Bay SHU has changed meaningfully. Indefinite placement, based solely on gang affiliation, has been ended. Step-down programs have been introduced. Pathways out of isolation that do not require the impossible choice of the debrief. The duration of SHU placement has been limited in ways it was not before. These are real changes. They represent the outcome of sustained legal advocacy, collective action from inside the walls, and the work of researchers whose documentation of the SHU's damage made ignorance increasingly difficult to sustain. But solitary confinement, as a practice, has not ended. In California, in the United States, in the democratic world, the specific conditions of the Pelican Bay SHU model have been reformed. The underlying question of whether extended isolation is a legitimate instrument of justice, that question remains open, being answered differently, in different jurisdictions, being litigated in different courts, being debated by researchers, by correctional administrators, by human rights organizations, by the families of victims, and the families of inmates, by everyone, in other words, who has a stake in what justice means and what it costs. Let me leave you with the image that I cannot stop thinking about. A man standing in open air for the first time in 15 years, trees around him, sky above, wind, actual wind, moving against his skin for the first time in a decade and a half, and the terror, not the relief, not the joy, not the sense of freedom, restored, the terror of a brain that was reorganized by 15 years of concrete and fluorescent light and 23-hour loops and the impossible choice between his mind and his life, a brain that learned the SHU so thoroughly that the world looked wrong without it, that man did not choose to be afraid of trees. His brain was taught to be afraid of everything else. And the question that image leaves me with, the question I want to leave you with, is not about him. It is about us, about the society that built the thing, that taught him that fear, that funded it, that defended it in court, that looked the other way for decades while the documented damage accumulated in incident reports and psychiatric assessments and the testimonies of men who had gone inside whole and come out in pieces. We built it, not any specific administration, not any specific warden or correctional officer or policy maker. We, the society that wanted the dangerous people removed, that wanted the problem solved, that did not ask with sufficient urgency what the solution was actually doing to the people it was applied to, and what comes next, what kind of justice we choose to build from this point forward is also ours. That is the only part of this story that is not yet written. This has been Act 4, the deep thought, buried alive, The Psychological Horror of Pelican Bay's Level 4 Security Housing Unit. Full documentary. If this changed the way you see what justice means, share it with someone who needs to see it too, because the conversation this story demands is too important to have alone. The Quaker reformers who invented solitary confinement in 1829 genuinely believed they were building something humane. They were wrong. The administrators who designed the Pelican Bay SHU in 1989 believed they were solving a real problem. The evidence suggests they were wrong too, or at least that the solution caused harm that no legitimate penological purpose could justify. So here is the question I want you to sit with. If every generation believes it is being humane, and every generation turns out to have built something that a later generation recognizes as a form of cruelty, what does that tell us about how we should approach the justice systems we are building right now? What are we doing today that the next generation will look back on with the same discomfort we feel looking at the Pelican Bay SHU? Leave your most honest answer below. This is the most important question in criminal justice, and it begins with you.